Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Great stuff. So my name is Victoria Jones, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how Bitcoin can potentially help us solve the problem of poverty. Now, this event that is being hosted here today by the Carlton Town Football Club, and one of their projects that I have a particular amount of sympathy for is their food bank initiative. Now, when I was growing up, hardly anyone had heard of food banks, but unfortunately, they appear to be becoming more and more common. And of course, this is a really poor testament to the amount of the degree to which poverty is increasing in our society at the moment. So how did this happen? I thought the world was supposed to be getting better, not worse. And if it is getting better, why is it not getting better? And what can we do to fix it? Hopefully we can do something about it before it's too late. So how can Bitcoin help with this? So in the Bitcoin space, we have a popular meme which goes, "Fix the money, fix the world." So that's an interesting statement, isn't it? How can Bitcoin fix money, and therefore how can it fix the world? Interesting question. So many of us are taught so little about how money works that when we start to scratch the surface of this subject, it becomes intensely confusing. Solving the problem of poverty, though, really requires us to understand how money works. Unfortunately, what most of us feel that we need to do in order to understand money is we just need to figure out how to save enough money in the bank and then for a rainy day, and then hopefully our social safety nets such as the NHS, unemployment benefits and pensions will fill in order to make up the rest. But unfortunately, I have bad news for you. The way in which the government manages our money is breaking. And the pound notes that we're using every day for value in our businesses are ultimately government vouchers that we use to pay our taxes. And unfortunately, many of us are colluding with the government in order to use these vouchers to exchange value in our business. So this sounds ludicrous, doesn't it? Why would, of course our money has value, but does it really? When we go to the shops, we notice that our food is becoming more and more expensive. And not only is it becoming more expensive, but it's also reducing in quality. How many of the kids noticed that they only got one chocolate bar in their Easter eggs this year rather than two? Not only that, but our houses are becoming more expensive, and a lot of new build homes have rooms that are much smaller than houses that were built in the past. And so, what do we do about this? Well, in order to know where we're going, we need to know where we've been in the past. The context is really important. History is really important. If you're lost in a forest and you don't know where you're going, if you don't know where you've already been, you can find yourself walking around in circles, having no idea how to move forward. You're wasting your energy. So the past is really important. And as Winston Churchill once said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Now, I have a particular interest in financial history. I've covered it somewhat in my book, Truth Decay, How Bitcoin Fixes This. And I cover more of the details in some of the newsletters on my website, satoshishpage.com, in order to fill out some of the details that go along with this. Now, there are a lot of nuances to the history of finance, and if I tried to cover all of them in a brief talk, you'd find it overwhelming. So what I've tried to do is produce a brief timeline just to give you the notable issues that happened in the past to help you maybe make a bit more sense of what has happened to our money, and therefore, by understanding this, we might have a chance of trying to solve the problem going forward in the future. So, where to begin? I'm going to focus my story by beginning in the 1700s. At this point in Europe's history, most of the countries of Europe were transacting in silver. And there was an important character at the time known as Adam Smith, who many people now consider to be the father of modern economics. And he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And in this book, he talked about how monetary silver had different proportions of silver in it. So the British pound had a 6 silver, the Scottish pound had 136 silver, and the French pound and penny had 166 silver. So even though everyone was transacting using silver coins, one of the problems with metals is that because you can combine it with other metals, it was possible at that time to devalue the currencies of these countries. Now, what this means in practical terms is if you wanted to buy a cow in England and it cost 6 silver pounds, if you wanted to buy exactly the same cow in France, it would cost you £66. And so, of course, this creates great difficulties when countries start to trade with each other. And not just when they're trading with each other, because, your currencies don't actually have equivalency, so it brings in more complication. But also, it creates a problem for the individuals of that country. And this is one of the reasons why the innkeeper in Les Miserables was portrayed as such a rascal. In a situation of devaluing currency, what happens is the businesses need to charge more and more because what they're taking in from their customers is not enough to pay for their resources to keep the service going. And so the services start to deteriorate in quality. And so, unfortunately, this poor character, is probably doing the best he could under the circumstances, but it's just a reflection of how poverty really starts to bring out the worst in people, especially when circumstances beyond their control are forcing them into difficult situations. So how did this happen? Why was it that England had such a strong currency compared to that of France? Well, to understand that, you need to go a few decades back. Obviously, the French Revolution, which was the basis of the story around Les Miserables, was in the 1780s. But leading up to that, there was a crisis around 1720 with the South Sea and Mississippi bubbles. And this was the management of these crises really made a difference to how well England handled their currency and France handled their currency. Clearly, the way in which France did it was a complete disaster, which is why they had such problems a few decades later. The story is quite interesting, and again, I featured that in another of my newsletters, so there are many nuances. There'd be too many to go into here, but that's a really notable point in history. The South Sea Company was essentially set up to manage government debt, because the government debt had exploded, and this followed on from the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694. This was set up due to an act of Parliament, and basically was an agreement that they made with the Dutch prince who came over and became William of Orange. Basically, Parliament were unhappy to continue to have a Catholic king. They made an agreement with William of Orange, who came over from the Netherlands, and this was known as the Glorious Revolution, when William of Orange took over in what was essentially a bloodless coup. And what was interesting about this character, prior to the Bank of England, the main central bank of Europe had been the Bank of Amsterdam. And the Bank of Amsterdam was a fully capitalized bank, which meant that they could only lend out the same amount of money that they had in their treasury. But of course, this created great problems for them, because if one of their big customers went bankrupt, it meant that there started to be a run on the bank. And so when the Bank of England was set up, it was set up slightly differently. They gave themselves a buffer in order to manage this, and this was known as the Fractional Reserve. And I'm going to come on and explain a little bit more about how that works in just a moment. Before I do that, though, there's a really important character that I need to add to the story, and this is Isaac Newton. Now, Isaac Newton was made Warden of the Royal Mint just 2 years after the establishment of the Bank of England, and he had a really significant role in managing the counterfeiting of coins, which led to the depreciation of the currency. And again, it was probably his role that led to the British pound having so much strength compared to the other countries of Europe at this time. And actually, in this way, he was a key figure in ensuring the success of the Bank of England, and the success of the Bank of England ultimately was the secret to the success of the British Empire. So actually, Isaac Newton had a way more pivotal role in history than just sitting under a tree waiting for an apple to fall on his head and inventing gravity, which is probably what most of us were taught in school. So going back to the idea of a fractional reserve, for those of it can be quite a complicated thing to understand. And I know many of you, because you're seasoned Bitcoiners, you understand about this. But for the newbies, because this is a conference designed for the newbies, I'm just going to give you a little cartoon just to explain to you how this works. So imagine you have a house, and it's seen to be valued at an equivalent amount of 10 ounces of gold. The purpose of the banks, because gold is hard, or any metals are hard to lug around, what the bank would do is they would hold that 10 ounces of gold for you, and then they would write a note to, if you wanted to buy the house, they would give a note to the purchaser of the house and say, we can certify that you own 10 ounces of gold in our bank, and therefore, if you give this note to the seller, they'll give you the house, and they'll be able to redeem this note in order to redeem the 10 ounces of gold that you need to pay for it. And so this is what helps the transaction. Now, of course, we all want to believe that all of the elite people in the world and the important people and those with important titles are honest, and they would never do anything to disrupt this system. But of course, that is not the case at all. And in fact, the story of the last 400 years is that that's exactly what they've been doing, and it's creating significant problems. So basically, there may be times when the government needs some more money for something, and so what they can do is they can temporarily suspend their gold standards. And so what happens is, they produce some extra currency into the economy, and the result of these currency units is that the price of things that can't be so easily printed go up in value. And so the house that was started off being worth 10 ounces of gold now becomes worth 100 ounces of gold. And of course, most people are very happy when the price of their assets go up, not so happy when the price of those go down. And so essentially, this mechanism is known as inflation. If you start talking to modern economists, they can get really tied up with the idea of what is or isn't inflation. But essentially, the basic idea is that this is what this is. And conversely, deflation is when the banks decide, okay, had enough of that, we've paid for what we need to pay for, we need to reduce these currency units from the economy, and so they then disappear, and the value of the asset goes down. And so that's what's known as deflation. And so again, when it comes to human psychology, they like it when their assets go up, they don't like it so much when assets go down. And of course, if the banks are playing this game in order to fund things for the government, really, they're stealing value from the people who own the assets. Because of course, once they've paid for other things with this paper currency, when they remove it from circulation, this has a direct effect on what everyone else is using their money for. Okay, so especially the Bank of England, because at the time, they were running the Bank of England. They really supported the development of the British Empire. In fact, many historians will comment on the fact that why was it that the Industrial Revolution started in Britain? Why was Europe so slow to get the party going? And one of the reasons was the Bank of England. The fact that they had this means of using a sound form of currency really helps to support, to help a country and makes it more prosperous. But at the same time they were managing this very strong currency, they were also playing games with other people's currencies. And a key example of this is the American Revolution. One of the things the British Empire did during the American Revolution is they printed additional continentals, which really impacted the economy of the southern states of America and probably had a significant impact on the northern states winning the war. Shortly after the American Revolution was the French Revolution. Now, of course, as I've told you already, France had real issues with their currency, and this was the background by which Napoleon came to power. And Napoleon was very aware of the dangers of devalued currencies, and one of the key things that he did was he actually paid his soldiers with gold coins. And so, for a lot of the soldiers who'd previously been paid with paper assignats, this inspired great loyalty in them and was one of the key things that gave him an advantage in this war. And of course, Britain wasn't used to this. They'd had an advantage from the strength of their currency for a while, and so, this was an opportunity for them to have a rethink. What they then did is they started having discussions in Parliament as to whether or not they should devalue their currency in order to fund the Napoleonic Wars. And so you've got this cartoon from 1797 where the politicians are effectively robbing the old lady of Threadneedle Street, which was seen to be the Bank of England. But ultimately, they won the political discussion, and they did suspend their gold standard, and they were very successful at winning the Napoleonic Wars. Eventually it gave them an edge and they won. But the thing about these battles is they weren't just battles where, killing of humans was involved. They were also high stakes gambling events for populations as well. And so back in England, a lot of the financiers were betting on shares of the Bank of England, depending on who won the war, because at that time, if you went to war with somebody, whoever won, the loser would pay them an indemnity as compensation for the destruction of the war. So this was meant to be a deterrent for people actually going to war in the first place. And so back in London, people were taking bets on what would happen to the currency of England, because if they won, the currency would go up because England would win the indemnity. But if they lost, the currency of England would be devalued because they'd have to pay the indemnity. So, it made a big difference. And at the time, there was a key figure, Nathan Rothschild, who was a key financier. He had organized his own communication routes through Europe, and so he was able to hear that we'd won the Battle of Waterloo first, And because many people knew that he had access to these communication networks, they followed quite closely what he did. And so as soon as he heard that he had won the Battle of Waterloo, he started selling shares. And so a rumour went around London to say that we must have lost the Battle of Waterloo. Everyone started selling their shares. Nathan Rothschild bought them all up. And then when it was discovered that we had actually won the Battle of Waterloo, he made an absolute mint. And that is ultimately how the Rothschilds won their fortune. So, clearly this was the period in time where Britain had suspended their gold standard. Shortly after this, though, they wanted to get back on the gold standard so things could go back to normal. But this led to the Great Financial Panic of 1825 and ultimately brought the first revolution to an end, because with the reduction of all of those, withdrawal of all those extra currency units into the economy, this had a huge effect on assets and the way in which people were able to transact in their businesses. And so for a long time, people learnt their lesson from this, and they really tried not to go into any big wars. And for about 100 years, they got a bit of a reprieve until it came to the First World War. And so it took about 100 years for these banking networks to really become effective. But in order for them to coordinate devaluing their currencies at one time, it really helped if they were linked together. And this was achieved through the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which was approved very sneakily on Christmas Day of that day. And then less than 1 year later, we were right into the First World War. Now, most of the important people of Europe realized exactly how Britain had managed to win the wars of Europe. So when the First World War broke out, they all knew what to do, and they all suspended their gold standards. And so the result of this was that, the war became so large and so devastating that when it was over, the cost of actually the indemnity that would normally be paid in these situations was absolutely huge. And of course, one country got the burden, and that was Germany through the Treaty of Versailles. I always wondered where that amount of money came from, and now you know. And of course, one country to pay that indemnity, it had a devastating effect. They attempted to pay it by devaluing their currency, and this is where the Weimar hyperinflation came from. You had pictures of people using wheelbarrows of money in order to try and pay for a loaf of bread. It was absolutely devastating, and of course, Europe was watching most of this and thinking, crikey, that's not much fun. What are we going to do about this? And so they had a Genoa Convention in 1922. And so they came up with this agreement, really with the First World War, the cat was out of the bag. Even though they'd created these extra currency units, clearly Germany wasn't going to be able to pay it back. And so now they had a problem. How were they going to manage it going forward in the future? And so the Genoa Convention, they agreed that rather than holding gold in their treasuries, they would actually hold the currencies of other countries. Sounds like a plan. And this laid the foundation for 1925, where Winston Churchill, another key figure who is credited with being the hero of the Second World War, before he had that position, he was actually Chancellor of Britain. And at that time, Britain was still responsible for the British Empire, so he was essentially the Chancellor of the British Empire. And so in order to solve this problem with the currency, he was a bright spark. He came up with the idea of a gold exchange standard, and this was in 1925. So it wasn't quite the true gold standard. They were trying to get back to where they were before, but he had to make a few tweaks in order to make it work. And so one of the things he did was he said that only countries could transact in gold. He stopped gold from being circulated in the population, which was a key figure, and he revalued gold at the same value it had before the First World War. And hopefully this would solve the problem. But you see, most of Europe had seen this before, and they weren't fooled. And so they decided that, when they wanted to be paid by Britain, they demanded the actual gold rather than their currency units. In fact, the only country they could get to play along was America. And so because America had these additional currency units, they were having a whale of a time. This is what led to the Roaring Twenties. But as the gold exchange standard started to kick in, there were a number of banking failures in Europe. This extended to America, and this is what led to the stock market crash of 1929. And so, of course, this was terrible. They were meant to have gotten back onto the gold standard. It didn't work. It created this financial crisis and had an effect on everybody. In fact, it led to the Great Depression, and many of us will have grandparents who remembered that time in history. And so, of course, there was a lot of political discussion. We can create all of these currency units for war. What about the poor people? And so this is when many of our welfare systems were developed. You had the New Deal by Franklin D. Roosevelt in America. And shortly after the Second World War, that's when our National Health Service was established. And of course, everyone thought this was great. They'd never seen anything like this before, and it gave them a lot of political capital. But of course, the first time you start these currency devaluations is when you have most value. What happens is, the money loses value over time. And so over time, these services start to deteriorate. And this is exactly what we're seeing at the moment. So after the Second World War, America was able to keep their nose clean for pretty much most of it. And because Europe was at war with each other, they sent all their gold to America to look after. And so after the war, what they found was that America had the gold and they'd made loans to all of the other countries. And so even though the gold exchange standard had failed in England, they decided to transfer management of the currency over to America. And so that was the point at which Britain truly lost its empire. And so they continued to use the idea of a gold exchange standard, but they transferred the management of the gold over to America. And so this was the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. And so this was the state of play. Everyone else managed their currencies against the US dollar. And this is the way it kept going until a date that many of us Bitcoiners are familiar with, the Nixon shock in 1971. Basically, America was pursuing war with Vietnam. They were potentially devaluing their currency to achieve this, so France decided to demand their gold back. Remember, France really knew what was going on when this sort of thing started to happen. And so Nixon said no, and that was the point at which no currency on the planet and no longer had a tie to anything that was solid, such as gold. And so ever since then, our currency worldwide hasn't been managed by anything particularly tangible. Really, it's managed by numbers, supposedly in reference to the debt. And you can see what's happened to US debt ever since they came off the gold standard in 1971. It's absolutely skyrocketing. And of course, this has huge implications. Debt for an individual, if you find yourself with too many credit card debts, you have to declare yourself bankrupt and have to start again. But the governments don't have that option. They keep having to pile on the debt. And this is demonstrated by the crisis of the South Sea bubble, which ultimately, was solved by Britain by consolidating the debt that was created by the South Sea bubble and carrying on. And so this was on Britain's books for almost 200 years, almost 400 years, and was only actually finally paid off in 2015. And so 400 years of a mortgage, I'm sure anyone who's taken out a mortgage, when they give you the breakdown, how much interest you're paying compared to what you're paying back, this is what the British taxpayer has been paying for the last 400 years. And so, we're not actually seeing it tangibly in our tax bills. What's happening behind the scenes is that in order to pay these things, the debt is just exploding behind the scenes. And so the effect of this debt is it's essentially stealing value from our currency. So how does this relate to poverty? Well, if you start to look into poverty, the World Authority in Poverty is thought to be the United Nations, who maintain their seeking for peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. And this is a picture from their website here. And they have some interesting data on this website. And they tell us that there are 734 million people worldwide who live in poverty. 55% of those have no social protection. This just goes to show that in Britain we're quite privileged here. The fact that we have access to these welfare services, even though we cheated our currency in order to pay for them. And only 22% are covered by unemployment benefits. They define poverty as those living at or below the ability to spend $1.90 a day. And they maintain that currently 10% of the world's population live below this level. But they are making strides, they are making progress, because this was 16% in 2010 and 36% in 1990. So effectively, they've reduced the level of poverty by 26% since 1990. However, in order to interpret this data, we need a bit more of a sophisticated understanding. If you actually compare the value of the dollar to gold over that time, you'll see that the dollar has lost 80% of its purchasing power over that same period of time. And so when you compare that number to the level to which poverty is reducing, if you use it using a sound form of money, poverty levels are actually skyrocketing if you look at the data properly. But of course, they don't spell that out for you on the website. You need to figure that out for yourself if you're paying attention at all. And of course, most people aren't. We've also, in terms of solving the problems of poverty, they maintain that innovation and critical thinking are encouraged at all ages to support transformational change in people's lives and communities. But nowhere do they want to address the problem of the fact that the little money that they have is essentially buying them less and less over time. Absolutely appalling when you think about it. If we analyze poverty rates, the Center for Global Development has actually produced this chart, which demonstrates how poverty rates have reduced, particularly in the 1800s. That's interesting. Why would they be reducing in the 1800s? And then they demonstrate that, from about the mid-1920s, they started to level off. So, okay, what were we doing right in the 1800s? And okay, it might be leveling off now, but it's not. That's not so bad. At least it's not getting worse. But what they fail to tell you is that they've collated all of this data in the dollar. If you actually put a graph of what the dollar was worth compared to gold over that time, you see that the value of gold, because that was, basically the way in which we valued our money, it was stable during the 1800s, which is what enabled these poverty rates to go down. But the moment we came off the gold standard and the price of gold rocketed, poverty rates are not stabilizing at all. If you take that into consideration, they're actually getting dramatically worse. And, it can be hard sometimes as individuals to take a step back and appreciate what's happening on a global level. And sometimes it's only when you collect data like this that you see what's really happening. In many ways, our modern technology is disguising the fact that a lot of our wealth has been stolen from us. But, if you look at the right numbers, this is what's absolutely happening. So how do we fix this? This is where Bitcoin comes in. When I first learned about Bitcoin, the thing that really impressed me was the fact that it had been designed to specifically mirror the economic properties of gold. And this is managed by the miners who have to solve a puzzle in order to verify the transactions. This makes sure that no one can cheat the system. These transactions are always going to be verified. The software protocol only allows for a certain number of units to ever be created. And of course, so this helps to establish the value of this money. And this helps with exchange of businesses. The mainstream media will try and tell you that it can't be used as a currency because it fluctuates too much. But, if you turn that backwards, how about the fact that maybe the fiat currencies are fluctuating against the price of Bitcoin? And of course, at the moment, it's still early days. As time goes by and it's not possible to create as many units and it's more widely distributed through the population, you're not going to get such wild currency swings. Eventually it will stabilize and it will be usable as a currency. At the moment, we rely on the politicians to make our laws regarding money and the laws regarding the banks. But in Bitcoin, the laws are made by the developers. But they aren't a law unto themselves. They rely on permission from the nose in order to approve what they're doing. And so essentially this is the general public, but not just anyone in the general public. They need to have an understanding of what's going on in order to vote or approve any changes to the network. And so the upshot of all of this is that no one person owns Bitcoin. It's owned by the community. The decentralized design of it means that it's not possible for any one person or any small group of individuals to manipulate it. And as a result, these features really help to disrupt some of the corruption that's happened with our money in the past. And by doing that, that gives us some sort of opportunity to address the problems of poverty that we currently have in the world. And that is why we support Bitcoin. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating, Victoria. Thank you very much. I especially like the bit about how Nathan Rothschild made his fortune for his family, essentially through manipulating markets and through FUD about the war. We see a lot of FUD about Bitcoin. I'm just going to leave that there. Who might be acquiring Bitcoin at this moment in time, maybe in a similar style to what Rothschild did back then. Do we have any questions for Victoria? Fantastic, great. Let's get a mic to the audience. Yeah, there you go. You take that one, Victoria. Is it working? Okay, questions from the audience?
Thank you, Victoria. My name's Tim. That was brilliant. Fantastic talk, fascinating insight. Can you just tell us what impact do you think the spot ETF, the approval by the US SEC in January for spot ETFs, etc., and what we're seeing now with those, what impact do you think that might have on Bitcoin and its what it was set up to do and what it might then do?
Yeah, I've commented on this at quite significant length, actually. I'm often a guest on the World Crypto Network, which is a program that's been going since the early days about Bitcoin, and we've been addressing exactly this question. I'm not equally enthused because, it really does allow the financial system into our garden, so to speak. And of course, they've got huge resources. And so their ability to manipulate Bitcoin and the price of Bitcoin is huge once they've been involved. I mean, certainly before they were involved, it was very much a ground root exercise. But of course, now that the financial system is involved, people are very excited about that because they think the value of Bitcoin will go up. But as history has shown, there's a lot of, as Chris has just said, there's a lot of corruption in the financial system. And so, giving our tool of freedom to those criminals, is not necessarily a good thing. However, I think at the end of the day, because of the way in which Bitcoin is designed, I think ultimately they've eaten a parasite that will end up destroying them. In fact, I think they think they understand it, but I don't think they do. I think it takes quite a long time to really get your head around what Bitcoin is and the mechanisms that it has. And of course, a lot of people on Wall Street are very conditioned to how the financial system works. They only look within their most recent sphere. They don't necessarily understand the history of money. They don't realize how the numbers are manipulated behind the scenes. And so they're almost arrogant in their hubris in thinking that, the game can continue. They've been this successful for 50 years. So surely we've mastered this game. But of course, the history of money before that paints a very different story. And of course, with Bitcoin being incorruptible form of gold, it is finally a source of number stability, which will disrupt all of their numbers in the fullness of time. But I think it's going to be a roller coaster of a journey. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions for Victoria whilst we've got her? We've got a couple more minutes before her time is up. Yeah, one at the back. Can I? So the question for those who are live streaming from the back there was, where can I find out more about the history of money, about what Victoria does?
Well, yes, I have my own website. I have my own website called satoshispage.com. I'm the author of the book, Truth Decay, How Bitcoin Fixes This. That's the banner just behind it, but there's a link to the book on Amazon on my website. I write regular newsletters, which explores, some of these themes in more detail. Some of the individual stories are really quite interesting. I find I get a lot of, intellectual interest from exploring these opportunities. I'm often a guest on the World Crypto Network with Dan, who just asked me that great question. And so sometimes we have an opportunity to discuss, some of these issues that come up live. We discuss any recent news events, just to kind of keep people updated on what us old school Bitcoiners think about what's really going on.